Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. We can go home now. For every note that has been played, and the years of practice, and the years of rehearsal, and the dedication and teachers, we offer our thanks. For the beauty of this place in which to listen and to worship, we offer our thanks. To the saints and sinners of Ardmore Baptist Church who have labored faithfully in this most interesting of time, we offer our thanks. For you who have kept the lights on, to the staff, to your pastor, to those who belong to the staff that has been functioning in a digital space, sometimes foreign to most of us, we offer our thanks. For the custodians, for the people who've kept this place beautiful and clean so that you could come back and gather and sing and be safe and be well. We offer our praise. My name is Linda McKinnish Bridges, and it's a delight and honor to be with the saints and sinners of Ardmore Baptist Church this morning. Thank you for the invitation. The story that Charlie read so beautifully from the Gospel of John is a giant pearl in a sea of pearls, a long Johannine string of pearls, little stories connected to little stories that tell the most wonderful story, this story of Jesus Christ. This morning, the story, the loaves and the fish. Walk with me into this story for just a few moments. It's a fine spring day. It's very close to Passover. The grass is green on the hillside of this Galilean lakeside town called Tiberias. Jesus has already attracted a host of people. He's been traveling and preaching and healing and preaching. And people are following him because he is performing miracles. Sick people have been healed. Blind people have been given their sight. Crippled people have put away their crutches. Jesus has even turned vats of water into the wine, the finest of wine, at a wedding reception, at his mother's insistence, of course. The crowds have grown to 5,000. Note the first century record keeping, however, of only counting the men. If we do it in our 21st reckoning, it could be double that, 10,000, and add the women. And if we add the children, it could even be up to 12,000. Let's just think of the seats in the Joel Coliseum for just a moment. There are 14,000 seats. Think of it in that kind of massive place with that massive amount of people. Jesus and his disciples go up a mountain. Readers of biblical stories know the significance of place in the telling of the gospel narrative. Why, when Jesus goes to the desert, you know what is going to happen. There's going to be pain. There's going to be withdrawal. There's going to be introspection. When Jesus goes to the sea of water in a boat, you know that there's going to be chaos followed by some transitions. Jesus is in a boat, the winds blow, the waves crash, and there's chaos until Jesus stills the storm. Jesus goes to a mountain, and you know from your reading of Scripture all these years that something is going to happen on the mountain. A new teaching, perhaps. Remember the Sermon on the Mountain in Matthew's Gospel. Remember the calling of the disciples on a mountain. Remember Moses and the receiving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. On this fine spring day, The children are playing in the green grass, and mom and dad are waiting for something big to happen. Something that will help them face their world, because their world is scary. Their world is harsh. They are living in their homeland as Galilean Jews, but they are occupied and controlled by harsh outside forces, the mighty forces of that Roman Empire. These forces struggle to maintain their power. Their political setting of this first century world seems eerily familiar to us in our global world here in the 21st century. In that Roman setting, there's political assassinations, there's violent coups, clashes between social classes, a tension between personal freedom and government control. Those who seem to suffer the most in this political chaos are the common people. Those families who are trying to make gardens and children. Those families who are caring for the elderly and are trying to organize their lives in a way that will make a difference in that first century world. But it's hard. It's hard when you're living in the days of empire, when the food and the goods are scarce, when freedom is limited, and fear seems to reign. The conversation between Jesus and his disciples is not about great philosophical, political, or even religious matters. If you were listening to Charlie as he read chapter 6, you realize that in that conversation, there is not even a bit of new theological teachings about God or Jesus' placement with God that we've come to expect to happen on a mountaintop when reading our gospel narratives. No, right now, the problem that Charlie read in chapter 6 has not theological ramifications, or does it? Has not political ramifications, or does it? Has not social ramification, or does it? Because the problem in this moment is food. It's food. Right now, the greatest challenge is food. There's a huge crowd following them, and it's lunchtime, and the disciples and Jesus are worried, where's the food? It's a big problem. We've been there, haven't we, some of us? We've planned the event. We've invited the guests. The event has arrived, but suddenly the number of the guests has increased. Oh, we go back to the kitchen and we put another potato in the pot, hoping that the food will be plentiful for all the guests that are there. It's the worry of any host, isn't it? Whether it's a large banquet hall, your apartment kitchen, or on the top of a grassy hillside, the question is, will we have enough food for everybody? It's interesting at this point in this story that it is Jesus who is worried. I kind of like this Jesus in John. He's been worried in a few chapters before, is there going to be enough wine at the wedding? He is a good host. I'd like to throw a few parties with this Jesus in John, knowing that the details would be certainly understood and taken care of. He now, though, is worried about the people and the food. So Jesus says to Philip, one of those quiet, not so well-known disciples, as the crowds continue to follow him up the mountain, "Hey, Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all of these people?" The narrator of the story, sometimes called the whispering wizard, turns directly to the camera and says he's just pretending not to know what not to do because Jesus already knows, but he's testing Philip to see how much operational savvy he has in this event. Whatever the cause, whatever the instructions that we have in reading here, it is Philip who takes the bait, and he enters into Jesus' own angst. And Philip says, yes, you are right. You know, even if we had 200 days of wages, we would not be able to even put a small morsel in everyone's mouth. It is that bad. We have a problem here. Too many people, not enough food. Then Andrew, another not so well-known disciple, really only knowing him through his famous brother, Simon Peter, this Andrew tries to be helpful, but certainly appears to be ineffective and lame when he announces his solution to the problem. I have found, says Andrew, I have found this little boy, and this little boy over here, this little boy there and there. He's got a lunch bucket. He's got some food that his mama prepared for him that morning. And that food has some loaves of barley bread and two slices of dried fish. Really, Andrew? You're going to feed the Joel Coliseum with their lunch bucket? You're going to do that, Andrew? It's interesting that the exact inventory of the lunchbox is there, right? So you've got 5 barley loaves. Barley's cheaper than wheat. This is not a very well-heeled community of followers. There are, though, however, 2 extra loaves, because 3 would be the normal fare for lunch. And there's 2 preserved dried pieces of fish. And it's a lad. No offense, guys over there, but it's just a boy, right? Just a boy, just a lad. But listen up, because you're going to see what little boys can do here in just a moment. Thus far, we've got one concerned Jesus who's deeply concerned about the detailed operations of the day. The operations that are usually relegated to women. Okay, what are we going to eat? What do we have for supper? There's one worried disciple. His name is Philip, and he's really concerned about having enough money to feed these thousands of people. And then comes Andrew, a visionary, a problem solver, gonna take care of this situation. And he begins to lay out the content of the little boy's lunch on the grassy hillside. They look at the meager display, and then they look at the people behind them. But think, the little lad was willing to give it up. The little boy was willing to give it up. And Jesus, with the confidence of someone who seems just to have called in a battalion of food trucks, complete with falafel and pita from downtown Jerusalem, says to this, okay, let's go. We're all in. Let's sit down and eat. And the story ends this way. Jesus, in a very priestly fashion, as if he's presiding over the largest global Eucharist in the first century world, he takes the little boy's bucket, the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and there on that spring day in first century Galilee by the waterside on a grassy knoll, he feeds over 12,000 people. Think the seats in Joel Coliseum from a little lad's bucket. If that isn't enough to send shivers down your spine, then look at the story's epilogue, because there are leftovers. Yes, fragments, leftovers. There's 12 baskets of them. You and I know that sometimes those leftovers are even the best parts of the meal. The morning after the Super Bowl, the morning after Thanksgiving dinner, the morning after Christmas lunch, those leftovers are sometimes better than the day it was cooked. When the people realize what has just happened, they don't need a majestic sermon or a mighty teaching. They do not even need to see or witness a majestic resurrection like Lazarus from the tomb or a healing as in the blind man. They know that this man is from God who has been sent into their world. What a magnificent story. Somewhat tamed, perhaps, by our show and tell pictures from the beginner Sunday school class of yore. But it's a really wild and spectacular story when you go inside it. Imagine the headlines in the paper or the Twitter feeds on your phone. By the time that event is over, the feast of the Fragments by the Sea of Galilee are pushed out through all the media outlets. But this is the Johannine way. That which seems spectacular is really common. And that which seems so simple is really so deep. Bread, water, life. Simple, day-to-day images, but are concepts for eternal life, not just simply physical sustenance. In other words, this story's got to be opened from the right side of your brain. Oh, yes, it's considered a miracle, and those among us, the scientists and the doctors and the quant and the theorists who look at the analysis of the Excel spreadsheet will want to know, how did it happen? The gospel writers even are so infatuated with this story that every gospel writer has this story of the feeding of the 5,000 in their narrative. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It's the only miracle that's in all four Gospels. We don't know how it happened. I wish I could explain it in a scientific way so that we would know, but we don't know how it happened. We don't know even if it happened again, but this is what we do know. We know that this story happens all the time. We know Philip. We can hear his voice in our head. How are we going to feed those people? We do not have any food. You and I buy into this illusion of scarcity. The illusion of scarcity. My North Carolina mountain grandmother's kitchen table at Christmas. You probably had one and have one just like it. In other words, it's filled with serving plates, brimming with creamed corn, kernels of love that have been minded from seeds grown into huge corn stalks right there in her backfield. Beans that have been poured into the cooker from the mason jars, which she lovingly placed in the dark cellar on a hot August afternoon the season before. Biscuits that were lovingly shaped from the flour bin in the cupboard, and a little lard, but her mighty strong hands. And she stands before the table as a priest would stand, and she places that old antique tea pitcher on the table, and then you know what she says. Those of you who are from the South will know what she says. She says, "I'm so sorry, children, but we just don't have any food." It's a Southern thing. If you can't get it, you just have to be a little more, linger a little longer in the Mason-Dixon line South, right? It's a Southern thing. "Honey, I just don't have any food today for y'all. I am so sorry," my grandmother would say every time we gathered, and the feast was right there before our eyes. "Oh, children, I'm sorry, I just don't have anything prepared for you to eat." It's not just a Southern thing, it's also a cultural thing in other cultures as well. It's the Chinese host this time, and she has invited us as a foreigner into her modest home in an industrial community outside of Taipei City. Only one room, cement floor for eating and sleeping. She cooks in a small closet on the back side of her apartment on a small burner and a wok. The small table that she set up in her bedroom for her and her guests to eat is groaning with seafood from every kind. Dark green vegetables, small parcels of beef and pork, bowls of glistening white rice. It must have cost her several weeks, months, maybe even a year of wages. She invites us to sit down, and we do, with the anticipation and the gratitude of such a huge feast. She's been working for hours, for days on this meal, and she announces in her language, you know what she says? She says in Chinese, 我们对不起啊，我们没有什么菜啊，我们真对不起，我们没有什么菜啊。She says just like what my mountain grandmother did, but my grandmother didn't know Chinese, but it was the same thing. She says, I'm so sorry, my friends, I don't have any food for you today. What do you mean you don't have any food? To my grandmother, the table is filled, it's groaning. To my Chinese host, the table is filled, brimming with food. How can that be? What is in us that each of us on some occasion prefers to see that the cup is half empty rather than a half full cup? How many wars have been fought on this planet between countries because of perceived scarcity? Trade routes for France and England in America's Revolutionary War, cotton and commodities in the Civil War, metals and minerals in USSR and Finland, oil in the South China Seas, microchips to support the digital revolution. On and on, lives lost and others' resources wasted while fighting for items we deemed essential but seemed to be scarce. So much for alternative thinking and innovation and priorities. And then there's the church, the scarcity thinking of the church. Habakkuk Diaz Lopez came to Baptist Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia in January of 2000. He had just come from Mexico. He had completed his studies at the National University of Mexico and wanted more theological education so that he could serve his church. He completed 2 theological degrees with us in Richmond, became a U.S. citizen, and then founded the Latino Christian Network and has begun churches in Charlottesville, Marshall, Warrington, Louisa, Culpeper, and all over the Commonwealth. We met for lunch one day in Richmond. I asked him about his challenges and his opportunities, and he described the expanding growth of new Christians and the growing, burgeoning church roles. And then he described his own struggles. He was having a hard time watching those church membership roles decline because some of those members that had helped him build that place now were moving to another part in the Commonwealth or maybe even to another state. They were moving to a better job, a better place for their family. And he confessed to me that day, he said, I had to change my attitude. I had to realize that the decrease of the numbers of members of my congregation did not correlate with the diminishment of my ministry here in Virginia. Rather, each time a person left the fellowship, that meant that the circle of faith for the Latino population in the Commonwealth had just increased. A seeming sense of scarcity as he watched that congregation diminish in size, but it was not real. For the greater sense of sharing faith was actually growing and growing but adjust he must to his way of thinking. His scarcity thinking was not real. It was just an illusion. We hear Andrew's voice in our head, but we also see that young lad. We want to know that young lad that was willing to give up his lunch bucket. John Bogle, author of Enough. Some of you may have read this work. It was published in 2010. Financier John Bogle is the CEO and founder of Vanguard Investment Group. He describes our current culture in this way in this book, Enough. He says, we're focusing too much on speculation, not enough on investment, too much on cost, not enough on value, too much counting, not enough trust, too much salesmanship, and not enough professional conduct. Too many 21st century values and not 18th century ones. Too much success and not enough character. Bogle wants us to know that we do have enough. Thomas Ricks, author of the just published book, he's a Pulitzer Prize journalist and has written a book that's helpful in understanding about our founding fathers. He describes the nation, or the best of our founders' fathers, and says that they believed in virtue. They placed their personal interest aside for the good of the whole. Let me repeat that again. Virtue. Placing your personal interest aside for the good of the whole. The idea of virtue, somewhat a lost concept according to Bogle, is found right there. One's asleep, one's awake. That's okay, but right there in those little lads, in the story of their buckets. Because sometimes we just glibly overlook that part of the story. And I say, well, maybe they were just told by some adult parent or some adult disciple to go give up your lunch bucket. But what if in that moment, in the humility of the child, in the willingness to share, he says, I have a little food. You mean you've got the Joel Coliseum and you're going to feed them with a little lunch bucket? And the young lad says, I have some food. What faith! What audacity of faith! Willing to share what I have been given for the good of my neighbor. Brian McLaren asked this: what would it mean for Christians to rediscover their faith, not as a problematic set of beliefs, but as a just and generous way of living in this world? This pearl of a story, this gem of a story in John's gospel, on one level, yes, shows us the supernatural power of the Son of God. But that's only a surface reading. There is much more. The evangelist invites us to go deeper. Through these characters, we ask ourselves, like Philip, are we living out of scarcity? Are we living with a sense of fear that we don't have enough? Not enough land, not enough jobs, not even enough toilet paper. While numbers do matter, and I would be the first to say hard decisions must be made often on the decline of population and on the decline of budget dollars. But do we live with the illusion of scarcity rather than a sense of abundance? You must remember, it is this Jesus who comes to us and says, I have come here so that you might have life. And what's the rest of it? And you might have life abundantly. The evangelist John places the little boy in the middle of the story. It's the pivot. It's the solution. But how many of us would be willing to give it up? Our own daily bread for the sake of the thousands. Oh, what will my little lunch pail do for all these people? I'm just a kid, and there are a lot of others who can do more than I can. But the lesson for us this day is in that little lad's lunch bucket. For he places himself and his lunch pail forward, offering it up, giving it for the good of others. The story is powerful, and may these voices continue to ring in our ear this day. Amen.